The summer of 480 BCE blazed across the ancient world like a forge fire. But nowhere burned hotter than the narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. Here, at this forgotten strip of land wedged between towering cliffs and the churning Aegean Sea, destiny would write one of history's most extraordinary chapters in blood and bronze. From the east came thunder not of storms, but of 1,000,000 marching feet. The Persian Empire, stretching from the Nile's golden banks to the snow-capped peaks of Bactria, was on the move. At its head rode Xerxes, the great king, whose very name made nations tremble. His army was not merely vast, it was biblical in scale, a living tide of humanity that drank rivers, dry and darkened the earth with its passage. Against this avalanche of steel and flesh stood an impossible sight. 300 Spartans in red cloaks, their bronze shields gleaming like mirrors in the morning sun. Led by their warrior king Leonidas, these men had not come to conquer. They had come to die. But first, they would teach the world what it meant to be Spartan. 10 years earlier, Persian pride had been shattered on the beaches of Marathon, where Athenian hoplites had crushed an invasion force and sent the mighty empire reeling. The humiliation burned like acid in the Persian court. How could the heirs of Cyrus the Great, conquerors of Babylon and Egypt, be defeated by a handful of Greek farmers turned warriors? The defeat was more than a military loss, it was a wound to imperial honor that festered in every corner of the empire. From the golden halls of Persepolis to the furthest satrapies, Darius I had sworn vengeance with the fury of a god, commanding a servant to remind him 3 times daily, "Master, remember the Athenians." But death claimed him before he could march, leaving the oath to burn in the soul of his son, Xerxes, a king whose ambition matched his empire's boundless reach and whose pride demanded satisfaction written in Greek blood. This would not be another expedition. This would be the empire itself unleashed, a campaign of such magnitude that future generations would struggle to believe the accounts. For 4 years, Xerxes prepared for war with the methodical precision of a master craftsman, forging the ultimate blade. From every corner of his vast dominion came warriors, Persian Immortals in glittering scale armor, their ranks always maintained at exactly 10,000 through a system that instantly replaced the fallen. Assyrian archers with recurved bows that could punch arrows through bronze at 200 paces. Babylonian spearmen whose ancestors had built the Tower of Babel. Indian war elephants whose trumpeting could shatter enemy morale before battle even began. Cavalry from the windswept steppes of Scythia who had learned to shoot backwards from galloping horses. Egyptian marines trained in amphibious warfare along the Nile. Thracian peltasts who could run down fleeing enemies like hunting wolves. The logistics alone were staggering. Engineers constructed floating bridges across the Hellespont, using hundreds of ships lashed together with cables thick as a man's waist. Supply trains stretched for miles, carrying everything from siege engines to the portable thrones of Persian nobility. A fleet of over 1,200 ships shadowed the coast, ready to land troops behind enemy lines or evacuate the army if the impossible happened and retreat became necessary. The army that finally crossed into Europe was less a military force than a migrating civilization, complete with soldiers, servants, engineers, priests, courtiers, and camp followers. Ancient chroniclers claimed the host numbered over 1,000,000 souls. Modern historians suggest 150,000, 200,000 combat troops, plus at least an equal number of support personnel, still the largest organized military force the world had ever seen. When they drank from rivers, the waters ran dangerously low. When they camped, they covered the landscape like a living carpet of humanity that stretched beyond the horizon. This was not conquest. It was obliteration made manifest, the very concept of resistance made laughable by sheer scale. The advance through northern Greece was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Xerxes had learned from his father's mistakes this time. There would be no underestimating the enemy. Cities that submitted were treated with remarkable clemency. Those that resisted were obliterated so completely that their names vanished from history. The message was clear: bend the knee and live in prosperity under Persian rule, or face total annihilation. Most chose wisdom over valor. But Greece was everything Persia was not. Where the empire was unified under one god-king who ruled by divine mandate, Hellas was a patchwork of over 1,000 fiercely independent city-states, each jealously guarding its freedom like a sacred flame. Athens and Sparta, the greatest powers, were as different as fire and ice. Athens pulsed with democracy and commerce, its agora alive with philosophers debating the nature of justice, while merchants haggled over olive oil and pottery. Citizens argued passionately about everything from military strategy to the proper way to stage a tragedy, their voices rising and falling in the chaotic symphony of free speech. Sparta was a machine built for war, where boys learned to hold spears before they could properly walk, and where death in battle was not feared but welcomed as the highest honor. Every aspect of Spartan society was designed to produce the perfect warrior. Children were examined at birth, and the weak were left to die on Mount Taygetus. Boys were taken from their families at 7 to begin the agoge, a brutal training regimen that forged them into living weapons. They learned to endure hunger, cold, and pain without complaint. They were taught that their shields were sacred, that to lose one in battle was the ultimate shame. Spartan mothers famously told their sons to return with your shield or on it, victory or death, no middle ground. For centuries, these city-states had spent more time fighting each other than any foreign enemy. The Peloponnesian Wars had raged for generations, with Athens and Sparta locked in a struggle for supremacy that seemed destined to continue until one or both were destroyed. But the shadow of Persia, creeping ever closer like a dark tide, forced them into desperate alliance. Fear of foreign domination accomplished what decades of diplomacy had failed to achieve. In 481 BCE, representatives gathered at Corinth's sacred isthmus and performed a miracle. They agreed to fight as one. The Hellenic League was born, fragile as spun glass but unbreakable in purpose. The treaty was sworn with blood sacrifices to the gods, each delegate placing his hand on the severed throat of a bull while invoking divine wrath upon any who broke faith. It was a moment of transcendence, when Greek civilization glimpsed its true potential. The strategy was born of necessity and geography. Greece's mountainous terrain and narrow straits could neutralize Persia's numerical advantage if the right positions were held. Thermopylae was chosen as the perfect killing ground, a pass so narrow that the world's largest army would be forced to attack in columns no wider than a few dozen men. The hot gates had been shaped by the gods themselves for this purpose. Ancient springs bubbled up from deep within the earth, their sulphurous waters creating clouds of steam that gave the pass its name. The passage itself was barely 20 feet wide at its narrowest point, squeezed between cliffs that rose nearly vertical on one side and the restless sea on the other. No army, however large, could deploy effectively in such terrain. Numbers would mean nothing, only skill and courage would matter. In Sparta, religious law created an impossible dilemma. The sacred festival of Carnea forbade sending the full army to war, but the Persian threat demanded immediate action. King Leonidas found a solution that was both pragmatic and profoundly symbolic. He would lead his personal bodyguard. 300 hand-picked warriors chosen not for their youth, but for their experience, and critically, for having living sons to carry on their bloodlines. These were not green recruits seeking glory. They were seasoned killers who understood exactly what they were walking into. Each had proven himself in countless battles, each bore scars that told stories of Spartan valor. They ranged in age from 30 to 60, men in the prime of their warrior years who had already achieved everything Spartan society could offer. They combed their long hair with ritual precision and polished their bronze until it shone like the sun itself. Not from vanity, but because a Spartan warrior faced death as he faced life, perfectly prepared. The selection process was brutal in its simplicity. Leonidas personally chose each man, looking not for the strongest or fastest, but for those with the most unshakable will. These warriors had to be married with male heirs. Sparta could not afford to lose bloodlines along with lives. Each man understood that he was being chosen for a suicide mission, yet the honor of selection was so great that many wept with joy upon hearing their names called. The 300 would not stand alone, but their allies were as remarkable as they were few. 700 Thespians volunteered to share their fate, choosing honor over survival in a decision that still echoes through history. These were not professional soldiers like the Spartans, but free citizens who owned farms and workshops, men with wives and children waiting at home. They could have stayed safe behind their city walls, but when the call came to stand with Sparta, they answered without hesitation. Their commander, Thermopylae, reportedly declared that they had come not to live but to die well. 400 Thebans were compelled to join, their loyalty uncertain but their courage soon to be tested. Thebes had a reputation for collaboration with Persia, and their presence may have been as much hostage-taking as alliance. Yet when the moment of trial came, these men would prove that heroism recognizes no city boundaries. Additional contingents from smaller cities brought the total Greek force to roughly 7,000 men. Phocians, who knew every mountain path, Locrians, who had fought pirates along the coast, Mantineans from the heart of Arcadia. Each group carried the hopes of their communities. Each man bore the weight of Greek freedom on his shoulders. Yet all understood that this was fundamentally a Spartan enterprise, guided by Spartan law and Spartan notions of honor that made death preferable to defeat. As Leonidas led his column north through the rugged Greek countryside, villages emptied to watch them pass. Women wept openly, knowing they would never see these warriors return. Children stared in awe at the red cloaks and bronze shields that caught the light like fallen stars. Old men stood silent, remembering their own battles and understanding the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The march itself became a form of ritual, each step taking the warriors further from the world of the living and closer to legend. The column moved with Spartan precision, each man carrying exactly what he needed and nothing more. Their shields bore the lambda symbol of Lacedaemon. Their spears were exactly 8 feet long, their short swords were razor-sharp and perfectly balanced. They carried no baggage train, no luxury items, no hope of return. They were traveling light because they were traveling to glory. The march to Thermopylae was more than movement, it was transformation. With each step, these men shed their individual identities and became something greater. Symbols of defiance, living embodiments of the Greek spirit that would rather die free than live in chains. Villagers along the route pressed forward to touch their cloaks or weapons, as if some of their courage might transfer through contact. Mothers lifted children to see the red cloaks pass, whispering that they were witnessing the march of heroes to immortality. Thermopylae earned its name from the sulfurous hot springs that bubbled up from the earth, sending ghostly tendrils of steam across the narrow passage. The pass itself was a masterpiece of defensive geography. Barely wide enough for a cart in places, flanked by cliffs too steep to climb, and waters too rough for ships to land troops behind the Greek line. Local legends claimed the springs were heated by the breath of the earth goddess Demeter, angry at the violence men brought to her sacred places. The very air shimmered with otherworldly energy, as if the boundary between mortal and divine had grown thin. Here, the defenders constructed their killing ground with methodical care. Ancient Phocian walls were reinforced with timber and stone, creating a barrier that would force attackers into a brutal frontal assault. The wall was not high, perhaps 6 feet at its tallest, but it served its purpose, channeling the enemy into a narrow killing zone where Greek spears could reach them, but Persian numbers meant nothing. Behind this modest fortification, the Greeks arranged themselves in the phalanx formation that had made them masters of infantry warfare. A wall of overlapping shields bristling with 18-foot spears, a bronze hedge of death that had never been broken by foreign enemies. The phalanx was more than a military formation, it was a physical manifestation of Greek ideals. Each man protected not himself but his neighbor, creating an unbreakable bond of mutual dependence. The warrior on the right relied on his comrade's shield for protection, just as that comrade depended on him in return. It was democracy made manifest in bronze and iron, free men choosing to stand together, their individual survival dependent on collective discipline. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part, harder even than the fighting to come. Scouts brought daily reports of the Persian advance, a black tide rolling south, consuming everything in its path like some biblical plague. Cities that had stood for centuries bent the knee without a fight, their gates opening at the mere sight of Xerxes' banners. The psychological warfare was devastating. How could any force, no matter how brave, stand against such overwhelming might? The Persian advance was calculated to inspire terror. Heralds had been sent to every Greek city, demanding the traditional tokens of submission, earth and water, symbolizing the surrender of land and sea. Many complied immediately. Others, like Athens and Sparta, had thrown the Persian envoys into pits, an act of defiance that guaranteed no mercy would be shown. Now, as the great host approached, the defenders could feel the earth itself trembling under countless feet. Villagers fled southward, with tales of an army that stretched from sea to mountains, of warriors in armor that caught the sun like scales on some impossibly huge serpent. The very air seemed to thicken with anticipation and dread. But the Spartans had been raised on impossible odds, weaned on stories of Thermopylae's strategic importance. Their entire society was built around the idea that a warrior's worth was measured not by the enemies he defeated, but by those he was willing to face. Death in battle was not failure, it was graduation to a higher form of existence, a translation from mortal hero to eternal legend. During the long nights before battle, the defenders shared stories of ancient heroes and sang the old songs that connected them to their warrior ancestors. They spoke of Achilles choosing a short, glorious life over long obscurity, of Hector facing certain death to defend Troy, of all the heroes who had chosen honor over survival since time began. These were not just stories, they were instruction manuals for achieving immortality through perfect sacrifice. Dawn came to Thermopylae with all the subtlety of a war horn. Through the sulphurous mist that gave the pass its name, the vanguard of Xerxes' army materialized like demons emerging from the underworld. The sound hit the Greek lines first, a rolling thunder of marching feet that seemed to make the very mountains tremble. Then came the sight that had broken the will of nations, rank upon rank of warriors stretching beyond the horizon, their weapons glinting like stars in the morning light. The Persian army deployed with the precision of a vast machine. Banners snapped in the wind, each one representing conquered peoples who had learned to serve the great king. The sun caught the bronze and gold of 10,000 helmets, creating a shimmering wave of light that hurt the eyes to look upon. The very air hummed with the sound of so many men moving in unison, the creak of leather, the rattle of weapons, the snorting of horses, the rumble of wheels on stone. Xerxes, confident that this token resistance would crumble at first contact, sent forward his Medes and Scythians, good soldiers, but not his best. These were warriors from the heartland of the empire, veterans of campaigns against Scythians and Indians, men who had never known defeat in open battle. They advanced in disciplined formation, shields locked, spears gleaming, certain they were about to sweep aside a handful of stubborn Greeks and continue their march to glory. Their officers rode ahead, surveying the Greek position with professional interest, calculating how long it would take to clear the pass. They had never fought a Spartan phalanx. The collision was devastating. The narrow pass became a killing field, where numbers meant nothing and skill meant everything. The Greek formation was a masterpiece of coordinated violence. Each hoplite's shield protected not himself, but the man to his right, creating an unbreakable wall of bronze and determination. From behind this barrier, the 18-foot dory spears stabbed forward in deadly rhythm, finding gaps in Persian armor with surgical precision. The Persians discovered that their tactics, so effective on the open plains of Asia, were useless in the narrow confines of Thermopylae. They could not outflank the Greeks, could not use their superior numbers to envelope the enemy line. They could only charge straight ahead into the bronze wall, where Spartan spears waited with patient hunger. For hours, the battle raged with mechanical brutality. The Persians charged with the fury of men who had never known defeat, but they might as well have been throwing themselves against a cliff face. The Greeks rotated fresh men to the front in shifts, an innovation that allowed them to maintain their strength while the enemy exhausted themselves against the bronze wall. bodies piled high in the narrow pass, creating obstacles that made each successive Persian attack more desperate and less coordinated. By midday, the ground was slick with blood and littered with the dead. Persian officers whipped their men forward, but morale was cracking. These warriors had conquered empires, but they had never faced an enemy that seemed to welcome death as an old friend. The Spartans fought with unnerving calm, their faces hidden behind bronze helms, their movements precise and economical. They were not men in the grip of battle fury, they were craftsmen perfecting their art. Between assaults, the Greeks would rest their weapons and clean their armor with methodical care. Some combed their long hair, a ritual that served both practical and psychological purposes. To the Persians, these men seemed less like mortals and more like servants of death itself, unmoved by the carnage around them, focused only on their deadly work. Frustrated by the lack of progress and stung by the growing pile of Persian corpses, Xerxes unleashed his elite guard, the Immortals, so named because their ranks were always kept at exactly 10,000 strong. These were the empire's finest warriors, veterans of a dozen campaigns, clad in the best armor Persian goldsmiths could forge and trained to perfection in the arts of war. They advanced with the confidence of men who had never tasted defeat, their disciplined ranks a thing of beauty, even to their enemies. Surely these barbarian Greeks, for all their stubborn courage, would break before the flower of Persian military might. The Immortals learned what the Medes had learned before them. At Thermopylae, reputation meant nothing. The narrow pass negated every advantage the Persians possessed. Their superior numbers were meaningless when only a few dozen men could fight abreast. Their cavalry, the terror of open battlefields, was useless in the rocky defile. Their archery, capable of darkening the sky with arrows, accomplished little against the large concave shields of the Greek hoplites. Worse still, the Greeks seemed to anticipate every Persian tactic. When the Immortals pressed forward, the phalanx gave ground gradually, luring them deeper into the pass. When the Persians thought they had achieved a breakthrough, the Greeks would suddenly contract, cutting down the overextended attackers with mechanical precision. The famous Spartan feigned retreat, a maneuver requiring perfect discipline and timing, confused and demoralized enemies who had expected simple barbarians. As the sun reached its peak, the heat in the pass became suffocating. The bodies of the dead created a carpet of flesh that made footing treacherous. Persian soldiers slipped and fell, only to be trampled by their own comrades pressing forward. The Immortals, trained to fight in open formation, found themselves crushed together in a deadly press where their weapons were useless and their armor became a burden. The smell of blood and death filled the narrow passage, mixing with the sulfurous vapors from the hot springs to create an atmosphere like the underworld itself. Flies swarmed over the corpses, and the sun beat down mercilessly on armor that became too hot to touch. Warriors on both sides fought through waves of nausea and exhaustion, sustained only by training and will. By evening, even these elite troops had been bloodied and thrown back. The pass remained in Greek hands, and the Persian dead were stacked like cordwood in the narrow defile. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne positioned on a nearby hill, is said to have leaped to his feet 3 times in disbelief as he watched his finest warriors repelled by a force they outnumbered by more than 20 to 1. Court officials whispered among themselves, wondering if these Greeks might be more than mortal men. The second day brought fresh horrors. Xerxes, his pride wounded and his patience exhausted, sent wave after wave of fresh troops into the meat grinder of Thermopylae. Units from across the empire, Assyrians, Scythians, more Medes surged into the narrow defile like water against a dam, only to break themselves against the Greek line. The defenders met them as they had before, the phalanx holding firm, spears darting like the sting of 1,000 serpents. Again, the narrow ground worked against the invaders. Their numbers meant nothing in a space where only a few dozen men could fight abreast. Leonidas rotated his frontline troops with precision, fresh warriors stepping forward while weary ones fell back to drink and rest. The Persians had no such luxury. Once committed to the crush of bodies, they could not easily withdraw. Herodotus writes that the Spartans fought with unnerving calm. Between charges, they would kneel to clean their armor or comb their long hair, not out of vanity, but as a deliberate display of confidence. To the Persians, these men seemed less like mortals and more like warriors preparing for an appointment with the gods. The psychological effect was devastating. How do you defeat an enemy who treats your mightiest efforts as merely an inconvenience? By late afternoon, the attackers were exhausted. They had fought in crushing heat against an enemy that seemed to anticipate every move in a place where retreat was as dangerous as advance. Xerxes, watching from his throne, is said to have leaped to his feet 3 times in rage as he saw his men repelled again and again. As the sun began to fall, the Persian assaults dwindled. Trumpets signaled a retreat, and once again, the Greeks held the pass. The defenders gathered their dead, repaired their armor, and prepared for another day. But while the Spartans and their allies celebrated another day's survival, danger was already winding its way through the mountains. A local man named Ephialtes, seeking reward from the Persians, approached Xerxes with a secret. There was a hidden goat path through the hills that would allow his army to bypass the Greek position and attack from behind. The third day dawned in ominous silence. No war horns echoed through the pass. No marching feet announced the approach of Persian battalions. The defenders stood ready, but their instincts whispered of danger. King Leonidas, his warrior's intuition honed by decades of command, knew that the enemy's stillness was not mercy, it was strategy. The truth arrived with a breathless Phocian scout who had witnessed the unthinkable, a column of Persian Immortals winding through the mountain paths above the pass. The betrayal was complete. A local Greek named Ephialtes, seduced by Persian gold and promises of reward, had revealed the existence of the Anopaea path, a narrow goat track that would allow the enemy to circle behind the Greek position. Under cover of darkness, Hydarnes had led an elite detachment up this treacherous route, guided by the traitor through terrain that few outsiders knew existed. The path was barely wide enough for single file, winding through pine forests and rocky defiles, where a single misstep meant death on the rocks below. But the Immortals were handpicked for endurance and discipline. Through the night they climbed, their armor muffled with cloth, their weapons wrapped to prevent any telltale glint of metal in the moonlight. The Phocian guards stationed along the path had been overwhelmed not by force of arms, but by their own disbelief. 1,000 Immortals appearing like ghosts from the mountain mist was beyond their comprehension. Some fled immediately, others tried to send warning, but it was too late. By dawn, the Persian elite were descending toward the rear of the Greek line, ready to spring the trap that would turn Thermopylae from a defensive masterpiece into a killing ground. When a breathless messenger finally reached Leonidas with word of the betrayal, the Spartan king received the news with the calm of a man who had always known this moment would come. He had planned for every contingency, except treachery from within Greece itself, and even that, perhaps, he had expected. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Surrounded and outnumbered, the entire Greek force would be annihilated within hours. But retreat would mean abandoning central Greece to Persian occupation before the main Greek army could regroup. The choice was stark flee in shame or die with honor while buying precious time for Hellas. The king's decision surprised no one who knew Spartan law and custom. The 300 would remain. Death before dishonor was not a motto, it was a way of life. But Leonidas would not condemn his allies to share Sparta's fate. Most of the contingents were ordered to withdraw immediately, to live and fight another day when the odds might be more favorable. 700 Thespians refused the order. They had come to stand with Sparta, and stand they would, even unto death. 400 Thebans also remained, though historians debate whether they stayed by choice or under duress. In total, perhaps 1,400 men prepared to make the last stand that would echo through eternity. Knowing that death was approaching with mathematical certainty, the defenders fought with a fury that transcended human limits. They discarded their long spears when the shafts broke and drew their short swords, transforming the narrow pass into a scene from the underworld. Bronze rang against bronze as the Greeks carved through wave after wave of Persian attackers, their red cloaks darkened with blood and dust. From the north pressed Xerxes' vast host. From the south, the Immortals who had circled the mountains. The Greeks were caught between two tides of steel, fighting back to back in a cauldron of violence where every step was paid for in blood. When Persian arrows darkened the sun, the Spartan Dieneces famously laughed. "Good then, we'll fight in the shade." It was Spartan defiance distilled into one-line humor even at the edge of annihilation. King Leonidas fell in the thick of the melee, and his men fought with superhuman ferocity to recover his body, 3 times driving the Persians back before forming a wall around their dead king. With weapons broken and numbers fading, the survivors retreated to Kolonos Hill. There, shields locked, they faced enemies on every side, refusing surrender. The Persians would not close in. Instead, they loosed storm after storm of arrows until the last Spartan and Thespian fell, buried beneath a carpet of shafts. The road to Athens was open, yet in dying, the 300 had won immortality. Word spread across Greece and beyond. A few hundred men had held back an empire for 3 days, killing thousands and showing the world that courage could defy overwhelming numbers. Their stand united fractious city-states, hardened Greek resolve, and paved the way for victories at Salamis and Plataea that ended Persian ambitions forever. On the hill, a simple epitaph was carved: "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." A defeat had become victory, a last stand that preserved Greece, and with it, the flame of freedom, philosophy, and democracy that still burns today.